Hey everybody, welcome to the Sanctus Forum. I am Michael Stewart Robb, better known as Mike. What is God like? It's a child's question. Maybe if you've had children or been around them, they may have tried to stump you with that one. I don't think that's their intention, but it's a good question. It's not only a child's question, it's an adult question. And that's because the quality of our life depends upon what we think of God. Well, we're going to talk about that today. We're going to be using Dallas Willard's The Divine Conspiracy. This is my first oldest copy. Believe it or not, there are at least two other copies in this house of this book in this edition, but this is the old one. And we're in chapter 3 here, just talking about this book with guests. I've got today with me Trevor Hudson. I'll introduce him in a second, but chapter 3 here, I have written in this quite a bit, and I don't know, I may have written in it too much to actually be able to pay attention to it. Just so you know, this is one of those longer podcast-like conversations. So if video isn't the right medium for this, there is a podcast audio-only version of it, which you can find by looking up the Sanctus Forum in whatever you use to listen to podcasts. Something else that you should do while you're Googling for that sort of stuff is check out our website, Sanctus.Institute, where you will find a sign-up form for our newsletter, which is the absolute best way to stay in contact with us. And I would just want to extend a particular invitation to any Europeans who might be listening to this. Sanctus is a European institute, and we, if you like Dallas Willard and you live in Europe, then we want to know you. And we hope you want to know us. But it's something that we are particularly doing for people who live with us on this continent, and a special invitation to you to keep in touch with us. And if you do want to support what we do here, you can become what we call a friend, and those are people who give and pray for our little institute, and friends receive a free gift this year, 2022. I'll go get a copy. This here is the free gift, Something to Say, a comprehensive bibliography of Dallas Willard. Check out the website if you are interested in, particularly being somebody that helps us stay afloat, as well as getting a kind of book that helps you go deeper into Dallas Willard. Trevor Hudson is our guest today, and Trevor is a former Methodist pastor. Not exactly former, he's still a Methodist, he's still a pastor at heart, but he has been a pastor of churches for a good number of years. And he's been retired for 6 years, but has continued teaching and leading retreats. He is one of the teachers for the Renovari Institute, as well as a few other initiatives that are similar spiritual formation-based initiatives. He helps to train people in the Ignatian exercises, works in conjunction with the Jesuits in South Africa, as well as lots of other non-Jesuits who are excited about Ignatius of Loyola. He still does individual and accompaniment for people, and he is an author of a number of books. I've got some of them here. I don't see them at the moment. Well, there's some good ones. He's got one coming out this year in September called Seeking God. I've already forgot the subtitle. Something Journey with Dallas Willard and Ignatius. We'll ask him because he's here right now. Hi, Trevor. Welcome.
Oh, Mike. Yeah, really great to be with you. It's a nervous privilege to be your guest on Sanctus today, but it's a real joy just to be part of your work in Europe. I've just for a few years now, I've prayed for you and Katerina in what you're doing, and just to be part of this is a massive privilege. Thank you so much.
Well, it is a privilege for us, particularly with what we're going to talk about here. I botched the end of your book. I think I did pretty well with everything else that I wanted to say about you, but help us with the full title.
Right. It's going to be published by Nav Press in September. It's called Seeking God, and the strapline, Finding Another Kind of Life with St. Ignatius and Dallas Willard. Okay.
I haven't read a word of it, but I think there are some videos in which you give some of the ideas from it. Isn't that right?
Correct. Yes, there is on the Conversatio website. Okay. I think there are 5 or 6 videos where I give some of the seminal ideas that are part of each chapter.
Yeah. Well, if you can't wait until September, I guess I'll provide a link in the description, and then you can go over and check out these videos. There is also lots of really good Trevor Hudson content to be found online, and so just Google him a little bit, and you'll find some wonderful teachings. Now, Trevor, your book kind of tips it off here, the upcoming book that is. Ignatius and Dallas Willard have been pretty big figures in your life. We might have to save the Ignatian one for another video, but Dallas Willard, how does a guy from South Africa find this fairly unknown professor in Los Angeles?
Well, I've often wondered about that myself, but the story begins with me getting mumps, and I laid up in bed in I think this is 1985, and I'm needing some audio cassette tapes to pass the time, and someone gets to me a set of his tapes that he had done, I think about a year previously, when he had been invited to Durban in South Africa by African Enterprise, a mission organization. And I just listened to these tapes, and they really, really, they touched me very deeply. And I had the audacity to send him a letter to just say thank you. And just to share my gratitude for his words, which really had touched my heart very, very deeply. And I asked whether he would come out and spend some time with us here in our country. Mm-hmm. I didn't have much to offer him, but he came, and that began a friendship that was profoundly formative in my own life. So that's how it began. That's what brought our little town of Benoni and Los Angeles together.
Well, let me add a few other pieces to that story, because I study Dallas's life, and there are a few things about it, such as how he got to Durban, you said, to teach for a retreat that African Enterprises was doing. He did this with a man named James Houston, who was also there at the same time, and who has gone on to write a number of books in very similar areas as Dallas Willard. At this time, 1985 is when it was, Dallas, he's published a book, but it's a very small publisher. And so it's still a bit of a mystery how he got into that international work. Maybe his friend Richard Foster had suggested him, but you can hear, if you listen to those recordings from 1985, the ideas that then show up in The Spirit of the Disciplines, published a few years later. The book was largely written by that time, and so I'm not sure about exactly kind of which came first in that, but there's clearly a similar path.
Yes, I think that your guess that perhaps Richard had maybe suggested to to Michael Cassidy of Africa Enterprise. I think that guess is a pretty good one. Yeah.
And then when you invited him, this is 1987 in the summer, well, in our summer, right, in your winter, to come to teach. It's like 3 or 4 weeks, and you had booked him solid in, speaking in different churches and different parts of the country. And he had never really done that kind of thing, like just constant teaching different churches, right, and that. Sure. He had done it for philosophy, but it was really a time for him to put together some ideas for pastors and ministers, right, that he then used for the final, what would it be, 25 years of his life. And you can find... Go ahead.
No, and it really was a very intensive, it was... he said to me, Trevor, put me to work. I'm not coming to, I'm not coming as a tourist. So put me to work. And he quite literally, for those weeks that he was here, he quite literally taught morning, afternoon, and evening.
Yeah. And a lot of those talks have been preserved. You can find them on conversatio.org, and Trevor helped us collect a lot of those tapes. And if there's anybody listening here from South Africa now, there are more tapes of Dallas speaking in South Africa. And if you've got a treasure trove or a little box of tapes, then get in touch with the folks at Conversatio, and we'll take a look and see if we've got something there. Speaking of that, Trevor, as a reminder, and I'll do this.
Yes, I know what you're going to say. I've got a word of knowledge. He shared his formation of his own faith and a little bit of why he follows Jesus, and I've got that. I think it's a CD. I have that. I have that in the drawer just down the corridor.
All right.
I will get that to you.
We'll talk. Maybe we'll get into a little bit more of your story with Dallas, but I do want to turn to our part of the book. Like I said, this is chapter 3, the very first section where Dallas presumes to talk about God, what God is like. Who are we dealing with? And the very last page of this section, for me, that's 66, very last sentence, he talks about having a mental blank where God is supposed to be, and how that really won't help us.
Yeah, I think Dallas really, I think he really had this very, very deep conviction, and it gets expressed very clearly in this chapter that, that what we think about God, or as I sometimes maybe say, our picture of God, that it really affects every dimension of our own lives profoundly. And I often think, I think it's William Temple's words. He was a British churchman or theologian from the last century. I think he once said, that if we have a negative picture of God, the more religious we get, the worse it gets. And in the end, it may be better if we are atheists. And that's that could be an overstatement, but it's a very strong statement in terms of the importance of thinking about what God is like.
Yeah, yeah. And it reminds me of a thought that's often given to atheists. The invitation to, tell me about the God that you don't believe in, and then I won't believe in them as well. That usually we have X'd out a God that isn't, well, let's be careful, that doesn't have much connection to Jesus and Jesus's people.
Sure. I think that often happens, and I think that's a very helpful and creative way to engage in conversation with someone, perhaps who says, "I don't believe in God," and I think that kind of response, does often facilitate a fairly creative conversation.
Yeah. You were privileged to get to see this book in draft form, right?
Yes, I would get sent through the mail, chapter after chapter, and I had the real privilege of just reading these chapters over and over and over again, and then daring to make a response to Dallas about them. And I guess the chapter that perhaps really created a certain sense of a certain kind of fairly sharp reaction in myself was chapter 3, and particularly the section that you have invited me to talk about with you.
Okay. Well, give it to us. What's wrong with this section?
No. I'm not saying what's wrong. What I am saying is what evoked a very strong reaction in me. Right. There's just that one sentence, where Dallas says, that God is the most joyous being in the whole universe, and that sentence kind of, it really landed in my life and kind of reverberated because, well, first of all, I hadn't ever thought that before. I was also reading the chapter through South African eyes. We're in the middle of a state of emergency, a state of one of the most evil policies that we've witnessed in our world, the policy of apartheid, immense suffering. And, I'm kind of thinking to myself, how can God be the most joyous being in the universe when this is going on at this point in our own history? And I just felt that if I were to say that publicly, it would almost kind of reinforce a kind of perspective by people who were really, really suffering as a consequence of that policy. It could reinforce a view that God doesn't really care. How can God be happy while we're in this particular struggle? So that was certainly one of the reasons I think there was a reaction to that statement. And I guess on the other hand, and I think I've mentioned this somewhere, I wasn't particularly high on the joy meter myself. I've had, my temperament has been on the side towards the seriousness of life. I do feel, I have felt, I continue to feel sometimes the senselessness of suffering around us, and also have a temperament sometimes that leans towards being discontent. And so I think, for a variety of reasons, I hope this communicates why that sentence, didn't meet with immediate acceptance and resonance. It was the source of a reaction. And so I when I had I was on a drive with Dallas, and I took a risk of sharing as honestly as I could my struggle with the third chapter.
In preparation for discussing this, I tried to remember how I felt when I first read this section. And I can't say that I reacted sharply. That's not accurate, but I do think that paragraph that you quoted from, and for me it's on page 62 in it's the first full paragraph from the bottom. Let me just read it. I'll just read it so we have it. We should, to begin with, think that God leads a very interesting life, and that he is full of joy. Undoubtedly, he is the most joyous being in the universe. The abundance of his love and generosity is inseparable from his infinite joy. All of the good and beautiful things from which we occasionally drink tiny droplets of soul-exhilarating joy, God continuously experiences in all their breadth and depth and richness. So that's the paragraph.
What was your response, Mike? How did it land for you?
It was very novel. That was not the presentation of God and I grew up in the church, so I grew up with sermons around me and people teaching about God, and with family members teaching about God, and that was not part of the curriculum.
Sure.
And I remember feeling attracted to God more with that perspective.
Right. Oh, that's a lovely word, attracted. Because I know it was so much part of Dallas's, I think, desire as a teacher to present God as one who is lovable and who does attract. And that's just a very beautiful word, to be attracted to God.
Yeah.
And certainly, and let me also just quickly say that, that my immediate reaction is not the place where I have remained for the last 20 odd, 30 odd years. There's been, I think that sentence was catalytic for me in terms of my own journey of learning to think about God perhaps in a different and in helpful ways.
Since I read this, I have, well, it's not really a conscious thing, but every time something similar to this shows up in what I'm reading, I always take note of it. And just to sort of, you probably don't need this, Trevor, but just show people listening, watching, that Dallas is not out on a limb here. I brought a couple of the books, and this one here is The Life of God and the Soul of Man by Henry Scougal. And he has a very clear statement. I'll see if I'll find it. Page 77, at least in my... There it is. It should delight us beyond all expression to consider that the beloved of our souls, God, is infinitely happy in himself. Right? And then somebody else here, this is Charles Finney, his Systematic Theology, and here, page 142, for me, I think it's lecture 9. Enjoyment is in fact the ultimate good. It is in fact the result of existence and of action. It results to God from his existence, his attributes, his activity, and his virtue by a law of necessity.
As I listen to you, Mike, with those very powerful sentences, I continue to wonder how those words land in the heart of someone who has suffered great evil. And I know, that opens the door to a major philosophical, theological discussion around the problem of evil, which I don't necessarily want to talk about, but how those words land in someone's life who really does suffer very, very deeply. And certainly I don't want to now, where I'm sitting now, and I don't want to lose the joy of God at all. And I don't want to lose the invitation to enter into that joy at all. I wonder if there is anything else that we need to say about God as well, in addition to that. And I guess that has been my own. No, you were saying in your introduction that I've been a pastor. That has, at one level, been my pastoral theological task. For years and years and years. So yeah, I don't know how you respond either to my wondering whether there is anything more that needs to be said about who God is, besides God is the most joyous being in the whole universe.
Yeah, Yeah.
And yeah,
I think that your question of how do statements like that land with people who are in the midst of great suffering, or have some trauma in their past, that's a good question to work individually with people on. And
sure. Yeah,
I'll say how those sorts of things landed with me in the midst of my,
sure.
albeit perhaps relatively less
Sure.
traumatic suffering. I think that they were for me a great relief to discover that at the bottom of the universe was something better than what I was experiencing.
Right, right.
And I have to say, most of my suffering in life was suffering in connection with God. I had some relationship with Him.
Sure.
And so there was a sense of walking together with Him, in a direction where things lead to much better places. And I think Dallas gets into this later in the chapter, what I'm thinking about, and hopefully what other people are thinking about, where he starts talking about he starts talking flippantly about death.
Sure.
And you start to realize that what we're holding on to here is not the end of things.
Sure. Yeah, I'm touched by some words that you used just as you were speaking now, when you said that when you reflect upon your own experience of pain and suffering, that these words, and I hope I'm being faithful to what you said, came as a measure of relief, that at the heart of this universe, as it were, there was someone better than the experience of suffering and pain, and I'm touched by that witness that you offer me, and those watching, listening, and I think for me, just if I may take the liberty of responding as well, that I think for me the figure of Jesus himself, and has been immensely helpful for me to really immerse myself in his own life and death and resurrection, with the conviction that Jesus reveals to us the kind of ultimately and definitively what God is like and who God is like. And so when I follow Jesus through the Gospels, there seems to be in Jesus this incredible capacity to weep with, to suffer with, to cry with, to share in the sufferings of. I think the Isaiah, a man acquainted with sorrows, and yet also at the same time, that doesn't rob Jesus of this immense capacity for joy, which which is kind of just runs throughout the Gospels. And so there is a sense in which, and this is what this chapter sparked for me, it sparked a kind of re-engagement with Jesus, both in terms of his capacity to suffer with, as well as his capacity to be remarkably joyful. And that as I followed him, joy wins out in the end. That there's a sense in which the joy of Jesus wraps its arms around the pain and the suffering. And so I kind of catch a glimpse of the divine heart that both empathizes, suffers maybe, and I know that's a very big word theologically to use of God, that of a God who weeps with, and yet a God who is also the most joyous being in the universe at the same time. So I think that's how the journey has unfolded for me.
I think of this refrain that you get in the Old Testament. The Lord is gracious and, what is it? Compassionate.
Compassionate, merciful, compassionate mainly,
Slow to anger and rich in love, abounding in love.
Right.
And it shows up in a number of different places in Scripture. And I think God didn't want people to have to wait to get to Jesus before he showed them his heart. And of course, Jesus just focuses this so well, and those stories help focus that compassion of God so well in ways that the history of Israel can't do. We as a human race need a lot of compassion. I was thinking this morning of how difficult life has been for humanity over the centuries and millennia, and things that the difficulties of the coronavirus are rather mild when you look at, medical practice 150 years ago was laughable for us now, the things that they would do to people that were sick.
Sure.
And so we have been always a species that's really had a hard time on this planet.
Sure.
And so compassion, graciousness, mercy have been how God has presented himself to us. Yeah.
And I think there is, and this is coming to me for the first time ever as I listen to you, Mike, there is in the word compassion, and particularly in my own understanding of how that word is used in the Old Testament, there is related to that word compassion both the ingredients of joy as well as the ingredients of suffering with or being with in pain. That is a word that does hold, for me certainly, that it embraces the joy and the pain and those themes of human life, that somehow God's compassion holds both joy and being with us in our pain.
Yeah. Yeah. You gave a little hint about how, and so did I suppose, about how we might start to conceive of God in those ways. Because, maybe people listening don't see compassion or joy in God. And but you gave a hint. You talked about immersing yourself in the stories of Jesus as one way of doing this. Could you, I didn't think I was going to ask you this, but could you help us understand how that works psychologically? Like, you read a story that involves Jesus's tears. And how does reading that story move a person to a point of thinking, of believing God's compassion or believing God's joy or whatever the character trait is? Because I guess to put myself on the other extreme, I mean, people read these stories and they think, great. That's what Jesus did, I guess. Nothing happens.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Let me seek to respond as honestly as I can. For me, living with a strong image of Jesus, I think it begins at one level it just begins at one level, at a very deep level, to shape my imaginative life. It becomes an image that I carry around with me. It begins to permeate more and more levels of my own consciousness. And that is an ongoing, steady process, affecting the way that I respond to life and also respond to God. I also want to say, on the other hand, that Jesus himself has a way of his own presence, of slipping into our lives through that image. So while the image itself is not the reality of Jesus, it for the living reality of Jesus and Jesus's presence to become more real within me. Jesus himself said he would dwell in his own words. I think we can say Jesus dwells in those images that we have about him. Now, and I'm not wanting to collapse everything. The image is not the reality. But as I reflect on my own journey with Jesus, the living Jesus has and I'm using a bad theological word here, has slipped into my life through the image. And I come to know that by some of the effects of his living presence in my life. So I wonder, I think Jesus did this in my life, or he has shifted this in my life. So I see traces of his living presence beginning to reveal itself in my life. And they might be very small shifts, but they are shifts that I put down to his living presence. So that's the best I can do in terms of that question that you asked, which I find a very helpful question.
Yeah, what I think was brilliantly said and opens my eyes some is that you notice that it is the living Christ doing it when you see the effects that it has in your life.
Sure. Yeah.
That it's not just a kind of theological brainwashing.
Sure.
But you see
Yeah.
you're living differently, thinking about things differently.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's been one of the strongest, we're encouraged in the Bible to give, to say something about the hope that is in us. And that is one of the strongest foundations of my hope, is the noticing of those shifts that I can only put down to the living Christ.
So what I'm thinking about now is, again, this a section here that we were discussing, and Dallas's interest in language, and I'll even use the word theory, that helps us make sense of who God is. And I think I do wonder if all we had were moments of inspiration, perhaps impressions of God's face, his compassion, his joy, such as Dallas describes here, his sense of happiness for God, a moment of going to a beach in South Africa and sensing a great happiness for God. So that's a moment which he keeps with him and is very important to him. But then it seems like that's still a step away from having those theories, the language that you might need to teach about God, to present God, to say this is what I know that God is like. How do you think, I mean, I don't want to put, this is perhaps my way of thinking about it, and if you think about it in a different way, then let me know. But how do you think we move from those experiences, reading scripture, experiences like on the beach there, to a kind of robust knowledge? Maybe, I think preparedness to teach is a very interesting way of describing that. I mean, then it's sort of there's a sense of you understand it, and that's what Dallas presumes to have here in this book is, I know God. I'm going to tell you straightforwardly, this is what you can expect of him.
In those pages that we're looking at, I notice or observe three threads in Dallas's, and I don't know what to describe this as, theological method for being able to speak being able to speak about God.
Mm-hmm.
And as I untangle those three threads, and let me just note them. I think the one thread is that he moves from human experience and how we experience life, and then he kind of, if we have moments of joy, then God must infinitely have moments of joy. And that, Dallas often does that, particularly in hearing God as well. He looks at human relationships at its best, and then he moves from human relationships to the way that God relates to us personally in an infinitely better way. So the one thread is moving from a human experience to God. Then but it's not a standalone. There's also the revisioning of God in terms of Jesus, in terms of what Jesus says about God and how Jesus related to God, as well as how Jesus in his own person reveals who God is. He who has seen me has seen the Father. So that's the second thread. And then there's the third thread of biblical language itself, and for Dallas, particularly the language of the psalmist. So those three threads seem to underlie the confidence that Dallas has in talking about God, and he seems to draw from those three threads of theological method. Now, I just want to add one more to that.
Okay.
And that's not...
Please.
But, there's also this, I think of the psalmist, and I didn't prepare this, great is the Lord and worthy to be praised. No one can fathom his mystery. I think it's Psalm 147. So that's using the psalmist's own language to say that there is no one who can fathom his mystery. So for me, I think that in speaking about God, I think we need to hold a tension of not being overconfident. That we can speak of God, but there's also a not knowing dimension about God. And so that in speaking about God, there is a knowing dimension and a not knowing dimension. And for me, that sense of boundless mystery, I always want to have in my own speech about God, and I'm only proof texting that with the psalmist himself.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Thank you, Trevor. I'll try to recap. Way number one was, I'll say, looking at your own soul, your own experiences in the world, and it's not entirely just an anthropomorphic, like, well, God must be a big version of me, but you do use clues from the scriptures, such as joy. Jesus says, I give you my joy. So you use your own experience of joy to sort of get some sense of what he is talking about, right? It's the one. So soul. The second one is looking at Jesus himself, his words and his actions. And the third one is the language in the Bible, say more broadly than just Jesus, and the Psalms being a crucial book for that. And then the last one is perhaps a sort of a knowing how much we don't know posture. And this is where I would like to add something here from what I know of Dallas's philosophy and his study of Husserl. And Husserl's understanding of knowledge was not a matter of, well, now we have every last bit of knowledge about something. It was always a sense of adequacy of knowledge. We have enough to, well, okay, you have enough knowledge of this as a book to deal with it as such. But there are so many aspects of it that still are unknown and unfathomable. Well, maybe not unfathomable, but they certainly aren't before my mind right now. And that's if that's true of material objects or things that we experience here on Earth, then why wouldn't it be true of God as well, who is far less accessible to us than the objects that we live with in our homes.
Sure. Thank you for that. I find that helpful. Really do.
Yeah. I really want to talk about philosophy with you, Trevor, and I see you're smiling because I know that but Dallas lands on philosophy here, and he drops British empiricism, the Kantian rationalist reaction to it in Germany, and big words, modernity. Let me just give this as an encouragement to people who are listening who are interested in those sorts of ideas. You hear the word Kantian, you think, oh, please, tell me more. I'm just joking, but some of Dallas's teachings in philosophy are now becoming available on conversatio.org, and we hope to be able to put out more of those, because there are more. It just takes a little bit of time, but that would be a wonderful place to dig in deeper to what he's trying to communicate here.
I am going to attend those classes when they get uploaded onto the Conversatio website. I'll be one of the first students enrolling.
Okay. Well, there is a metaphysics one already there, that complete as we have it and will have it, and so you can already go and listen to that one, to you, Trevor, as well as to you listening. But let's not make this a philosophy podcast, because I am talking not to a philosopher but to a pastor. Somebody who God has given the vocation of helping his people forward in life, to talk about God. And we come to a section like this, we come to the scriptures, we have a lot of us a sort of default theology. Probably a mixture of good and bad, things that are accurate, things that are inaccurate. And as I said in my little introduction, these default theologies can be very powerful in our lives. And, in a sense, something of your default theology is what reacted sharply to what Dallas was presenting here. So, what are ways that we can deal with our default theologies and move on to something better, and I'll just be so bold as to say more suited to our life here on earth?
I think, thanks, Mark. I think that I think sometimes the starting point is just to recognize what I do believe. What is my default? So I think coming to terms with what I've been taught over the years, the pictures of God that have come my way via my culture, church, school, etc. I think a good starting point sometimes is simply to pay attention to what I do believe in relation to God, and to give that some serious thought. And I would encourage that. I think in terms of if we use the language of healing some of my default picture, I think there are a number of pathways that we can go through. So
can I interrupt you for a moment?
Please.
On discerning our default theology, what would you do there? Like if I woke up on a Monday morning and I wanted to do that.
Sure. Well, I think that it can be helpful to ask myself, when life doesn't turn out the way I wanted to turn out, when my life crashes, when things go really wrong in my life, what do I immediately think about God? Immediately. And I think that kind of immediate question brings to the surface, I think, quite quickly what I think about God, particularly in moments like that. God must be punishing me. What did I do wrong to deserve this? Et cetera, et cetera. I think those kind of immediate thoughts are really giveaways. They are clues as to the default. So that would be a little bit of my response to you. I think my default revealed itself not so much in that way, but it revealed itself in the way I was living. I constantly felt I needed to somehow please God, and please God with, I drove, and to some extent it's not totally healed. I needed to get God's attention somehow by, producing or working hard, pleasing others. Somehow I needed to please God. And that if I didn't put in my effort, somehow God wasn't going to show up for me. So it was more in my own way of living that kind of revealed a default picture of God. So that would be my immediate response to what you said. And I think then in terms of the healing of that, and I'm just going to kind of brainstorm myself here, I think sometimes it's good for me to get in touch with my experiences of being loved through my life, and then to allow those experiences of being loved through my life to become a little bit of a stepping stone. That if this is how I've been loved by a human being, how much more, infinitely more, does God love me? And so again, it's that one strand of theological method of starting with human experience. So I would suggest pay attention to experiences of being loved, my experiences of enjoyment of life, and then to actually believe that God could be sharing this enjoyment with me. So starting with human experiences of being loved, of enjoyment, of feeling really alive can be helpful. I think another thread is paying attention to the gifts of my life and to what is, that I live each day within a context of gifts, starting with the gift of my own life, that actually I have the gift of being. And that just fills me often with a sense of wonder and joy that I have been, to use my language here, desired into being by a God who wants me to be here, and that I'm not here by mistake, that my life isn't random, that I occupy a space in the universe that no one else occupies, and you occupy a space that no one else. It just opens my life up a little bit to a sense of wonder and a sense of, I think, I dare to think the thought that God enjoys my existence and that I bring joy to God. And somehow that begins to set in motion processes that are very deep in terms of thinking differently about God, but even more importantly, relating differently to God. That I'm relating to the God who actually has desired me into being and wants me to be here. And that just changes the nature of relations between God and myself. And I could say far much more, but let me stop there.
I remember once that you described a discipline, spiritual discipline, in which involved dancing in the kitchen.
Right.
How's that going?
Yes, I think when this whole change began in my life, sparked by that sharp reaction, and then, exploring the life of Jesus, discovering that Jesus is a man of sorrows and a man of joy, and that Jesus once said, I've said all these things to you so that my joy can be in you. I knew that joy wouldn't fall on my head, that I needed to open myself up to joy as well as ask for it. And I very consciously, and it remains a part of my life, very consciously wanted to shape my life around some practices of joy. And one of them, which is the one you're referring to, which is still part of my life, is that when certain, we often have music in the house, and when when Ed Sheeran comes on, I don't know if Ed Sheeran rings a bell for you, but when Ed Sheeran comes on, Debbie and I, Debbie's the woman I'm married to, we have pledged that we will meet in the kitchen and dance. So whenever Ed Sheeran comes on the radio, or Sam Smith, one or two others, we have pledged to drop everything that we do, meet in the kitchen and dance. And somehow, you know, that dance takes me to what you were saying earlier, Mike, that at the heart of this universe, there is someone better than the pain and the sorrow and the heartache. Because there have been moments of heartache and heartbreak recently for us, and yet we have continued to meet in the kitchen to dance, that there is something better than the heartache and the heartbreak.
Thank you, Trevor. I'll expect your dance video. You can send that to me on email.
Right.
And we'll just start it right now, okay? Just
okay.
There. I hope you all enjoy that. No, but thank you for being here and helping us to unpack these few pages in a way with life.
I hope so. And thank you so much for the opportunity. I've enjoyed this immensely. Thank you. Thanks, Mike.
And to all of you, thank you for being here. Thanks for getting all the way to the end of the podcast or video or whatever it is you're interacting with us on. Please subscribe, write nice notes to us in the comments. Find Trevor over at his Twitter account where he posts night prayers. And check out that almost monthly newsletter. And if you'd like, you can become a friend and we'll send one of these books to you. Oh, I should have said this earlier. You do kind of have to live in the US or Europe. We're actually not that good at. Maybe we can get a few of them to South Africa, and if you're listening from there, we can send out some of those. But anyway, see you next time. Bye. Okay.
Well,
thank you.
I now entrust myself to your editorial skill.
That's right. My editorial skill is getting better.
Oh, I've noticed that.